So welcome to the webinar today on Towards a Convention for the Rights of Older Persons. I'm pleased to present this webinar in collaboration with the Canadian Network for the Prevention of Elder Abuse, as well as our community partners who I will introduce in a few minutes. We want to give some short housekeeping items just so everyone knows the logistics for today. Everyone will be muted during the webinar. You won't have any video or be able to talk. That's why we encourage you to put your questions in the question box. This is being recorded and will be on our website in a few days, probably next week, and will be posted along with other resources that will be shared with us today. We do have ASL interpreters joining us today, and you will see them at the side of your screen. And if you need to adjust the size of the image for any of the speakers, you can pull the black line on the left side of the box larger to make that image larger for yourself. The speakers will be visible for those who are speaking at the time. We will be having all speakers and panel members visual when we do our panel discussion and question and answer period. So you'll have an opportunity to see everyone at that time. As I indicated, you can use the chat box to make comments or just indicate where you're from. If you see someone a colleague, that's the area you can do that. We would like you to post your questions to the panel only in the question and answer box. It makes it a little bit easier for us to navigate where the questions are from, because we do have quite a few today on our session. So if you would appreciate you doing that. And at the end, we have an evaluation that we would ask you just to give us some feedback on today's session, as well as other ideas for future webinars that we will host in the future. I'd like just to begin and do a land acknowledgement from the territory that we are from in Ontario. And this is from Elder Abuse Ontario. We endeavor to honor the land and the treaties by strengthening our relationship and responsibilities to them. We live and work on the Métis, Anishinaabe, and Cree territories. The presence of settlers is not neutral. It has and has continued to have devastating impacts on the many aspects of life for Indigenous peoples. Many of our practices, including the way we care for our elders, the way we educate, and our methods of creating community, came to these lands through the ongoing process of colonialism. We hold a new understanding in our interactions and engagements with the land and its people. There's important work being done by many nations and allies to ensure the continued and thriving of communities and knowledge systems. Those of us who are settlers need to recognize that our knowledge and the way of doing things may not be the priority as we work towards a safe communities for all seniors. I want to just provide an overview of how the session will be held today. We will go through a little bit about our organizations in terms of the Canadian Network and Ontario Elder Abuse Prevention group. And then I'm going to turn it over to our speaker, Margaret Gillis, from as our speaker, talking about the human rights and the need for a convention for the rights of older adults. And we will then have a panel discussion from all of our guests who will introduce in a minute, and they will give at least a 5 to 7 minute overview of their position around the need for a convention and the human rights for older persons. And then we'll have an open discussion or interactive discussion with your question and answers with those panel members. And then we will finally sum up, and Benedict will talk about our need for a call for action at the end, engaging you as participants in society to promote the need for this convention and the actions that you can take as an individual or community to push this movement forward. So a little bit about our organization. Elder Abuse Prevention Ontario is a nonprofit organization, obviously a provincial-wide nonprofit organization. And really the work that we do ensures that seniors are free from abuse, feel safe and respected. And we try to encourage that strong voice for seniors in advocacy in the work that we do. We implement Ontario's strategy to combat elder abuse, and we work through working with community partners across Ontario, Canada, and nationally, internationally, to try to provide training and education to seniors and service providers. We work with those agencies to increase our response and coordination of our efforts. And we do a lot of education and outreach to seniors in our communities to let them know around actions that they can do to prevent and protect themselves from being abused. You can look at more information about our organization at our website at eapon.ca. And I'd like to introduce the Canadian Network for the Prevention of Elder Abuse, which is Executive Director, as you'll see on screen, is Benedict Chaflin. And she is worked with Benedict for a number of years and a great colleague, and has moved that organization forward for the last, I think, last 5 to 10 years. We've kind of really come forward with that organization. But the mission really is to connect individuals and organizations across Canada and beyond, and foster that exchange of information and advances of program development to prevent elder abuse. It is really the national hub in Canada where you can get information and resources on elder abuse. And no matter what jurisdiction you're in, if you need to find out what help is in local within your jurisdiction, you can find, if I live in Alberta, you can find those key resources and information on that website. Really, their vision is to also ensure that seniors are valued, respected, and live free from abuse. So we share common goals and mandates and resources in the work that we do. So I'm very pleased to partner with CNPA again, and we continue to do so, because the issue that we're talking about today is a Canadian issue around the human rights of older persons. And these issues, we need to work together to have a stronger voice. And we felt that this would be a great opportunity for us to work together. I'm pleased to bring an expert panel of esteemed speakers today. We're so pleased to have Margaret Gillis, who will be doing our short introduction presentation. She's with the International Longevity Centre of Canada. She's done a lot of work around the human rights of older persons, and you will hear from her about all the work that she's doing to get this momentum move forward, and the work that she's done not only within Canada, but internationally and at the UN and other many working groups that she's involved with, which she will describe. We'll then have Dr. Kieran Rabu, who will also join us. He's a physician, a geriatric psychiatrist, also professor of psychiatry at the University of Ottawa. He's a board member and founding board member for the International Longevity Centre of Canada, and also the chair of GARUP as well. And then we have Margaret Young, who's the founder of Age Noble, who is also a steering group member of GARUP. And lastly, we have Marie Beaulieu from I believe she's in Montreal, in Quebec area. She's research chair on the mistreatment of older persons and also on the International Network for the Prevention of Elder Abuse. So I thank you all for joining us, and you will see everyone after the short presentation from Margaret, and I'm going to turn it over to her to start the presentation.
Good morning. If we could move to slide 2. Second slide. Thank you. Terror awakened, devastating, emotional, broken-spirited, and muzzled and trapped. If I asked you who spoke these words and what they were describing, you would think I was talking about desperate people stuck in a terrifying situation. And you would be right. For these heart-wrenching words are spoken by frail older Canadians living in long-term care homes during the current pandemic. These are direct quotes from the interim report of the Government of Ontario's Independent Long-Term Care COVID-19 Commission. It just came out on October 23rd. And they reflect the voices and views of older people, some of whom are in downtown Toronto, one of the wealthiest cities in one of the wealthiest countries in the world, our country. Our country is known for its fulsome social supports, including free healthcare and social safety nets, a country of compassion and empathy, repeatedly listed as one of the best places in the world to live, but not, it seems, if you are very old, very vulnerable, and in the wrong care home. Without doubt, we have to examine our current situation and determine how we found Canada in a place where our citizens most in need have been left behind. As we discuss the rights of older people today, I challenge you to consider how we can better their/our lives through a realization of rights. Next slide, please. The International Longevity Centre is a human rights-based organization, and it's dedicated to the needs of older persons. We were established in 2014, and we're part of a 16-country global alliance of international longevity centres. Since 2015, the International Longevity Centre of Canada has been actively engaged in the work at the United Nations, and we're committed to ensuring that older people have their rights enshrined in a legally binding international instrument called the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Older Persons. Sadly, to date, our country has not supported our efforts to protect the rights of older people in a convention. Since much of our domestic and international work has focused on the UN Convention on the Rights of Older Persons, I will today be providing you with a fulsome outline of why it matters and how it contributes to bettering the lives of older people. Our recent activism, which is directly linked to the pandemic, includes demands for reform of the long-term care system in Canada, which we'll also be discussing in terms of the issue of rights. Now, both Kieran and I are actively involved at the Global Alliance at the on the Rights of Older Persons, GARUP. He's the chair, as mentioned, and I am the chair of the Advocacy Working Group. I really want to acknowledge and thank the other panelists, Kieran, Marie, and Margaret, for their dedication and work to move towards a convention on the rights of older persons, both at the United Nations and in Canada. I also want to acknowledge a couple of the international people who are on the call and the webinar. Frances Zinedine, who is the NGO chair on aging at the UN, and Erica Dar from AARP, and Bridget Pentnell from the UK. I also want to acknowledge in Canada the work of Laura Tamblin-Watts at CanAge and Jane Barrett at the IFA. Next slide, please. So international longevity centers were the brainchild of Dr. Robert Butler, who was a very well-known geriatrician from Columbia University who passed away a couple of years ago. Dr. Butler coined the term ageism back in 1969 as a combination of prejudicial attitudes to older people, old age, and aging itself. Now, ageism can take many forms: pervasive employment discrimination, biased healthcare, as we saw in the pandemic, lack of appropriate housing, as we have seen in some long-term care situations, and media marginalization. Moreover, ageism is an ism like no other because it relates to a universal condition. And while the evil nature of prejudice is ignorance and hostility, ageism has the extra bonus of creating self-hate in the old, while for the young, it's a prejudice against your future self. The COVID-19 pandemic has been a magnifying glass on ageism. We saw older people negatively stereotyped, portrayed as a homogeneous group, one that possesses demographic, social, and financial challenges. Ageism is also expressed through individual and systemic discriminatory behavior towards older adults, such as indifference, patronizing attitudes, and in its worst form, abandonment, which is exactly what happened in Canada during the pandemic. Next slide, please. So, like no other time in Canadian history, the COVID-19 pandemic has illustrated the need for a human rights response to the needs of older people. This photo from the Toronto Star speaks volumes. It was described as a graveyard of wheelchairs of people who had died of COVID, and it was found in the back of a care home in downtown Toronto. We know that older people are one of the most severely impacted groups in this worldwide crisis, and we know that the rights and contributions of older people are often overlooked in politics and in practice. The statistics are grim, with the pandemic's brutal effect having resulted in fatality rates 5 times higher for older people than the global average. And in Canada, to our national shame, we have seen 95% of COVID deaths in people over the age of 60. And while Canada's overall COVID-19 death rate is relatively low compared to other OECD countries, the proportions of death in long-term care is double the OECD average, with 81% of deaths in Canada being long-term care residents, compared with an average of 42 in the other 16 OECD countries. Next slide. As well, we Canadians have the most horrific images burned in our memory that beg for true compassion and a swift human rights response. Who can forget the media reports of older people left in their beds to die of COVID without medical aid, or older people dying of dehydration or malnutrition in the middle of our rich cities, or the images of family members of older persons outside care facilities, hoping to catch a glimpse of their loved one, whom they have not heard from in days, only to hear that they had been abandoned or left to die in some horrific manner. Or the brave workers who moved into long-term care homes or risked their own health or that of their families to provide care, sometimes without proper personal protective equipment. We must ask ourselves if we would have allowed this to happen in our schools, in our daycare centers, hospitals, or any other institution. Is Canada a country that leaves its most vulnerable to die? A country that has left a long-term care system so incapable of handling a crisis that it has to rely on the army to rescue vulnerable people? Because that, as we all know, is what happened. The government of Canada had to employ the army to go into long-term care homes in 2 provinces, our largest provinces, Quebec and Ontario, and they may be required in another province, Saskatchewan, which we heard about yesterday. The army was deployed, and what they saw shocked them so much that they wrote a scathing report on their experiences. A year ago, I doubt any Canadian would believe that the Canadian military would release a report of unimaginable misery and neglect of vulnerable older people, not that took place in some faraway country requiring Canadian peacekeepers, but in Canada with our sophisticated healthcare systems and our laws against age discrimination. Yet it happened here, and it will happen again if we don't take the steps to ensure that Canada becomes more compassionate and that the human rights of people of all ages are protected and respected. Quite literally, COVID-19 has changed the lens from indifference to abuse and abandonment, from implicit to explicit and openly hostile ageism. I do want to note that there are well-run long-term care homes in Canada, and we can certainly learn from them. But we need to acknowledge that there is a mountain of evidence that we have a huge problem on our hands. Next slide. The 15-page report of the Canadian Armed Forces Joint Task Force, which came out at the end of May and is quite literally hard to read, so graphic are the details of neglect and abuse. And it happened, as I mentioned, smack in the middle of our largest cities. It revealed severe instances of regulatory neglect spanning from non-existent policies, such as improper use of protective equipment, to use of expired medications, inadequate medical supplies, and infiltration of insects and vermin. Also documented were poor standards of care, including poor catheter hygiene, underfeeding or non-treatment of bed sores, to outright abuse, aggressiveness, demeaning comments, and force feeding of residents. The atrocities in those long-term care homes, which were so carefully documented in the Canadian Armed Forces report, is undoubtedly linked to ageism in its most hostile form. While we can all claim to be saddened over the loss of life and the ill treatment of older people in long-term care, many of us cannot say that we're surprised. Many of these issues have been known for years, documented in media reports. For instance, there was an entire inquiry undertaken when a nurse murdered 8 older Ontario citizens in long-term care, and she was only discovered because she confessed to her pastor. The resulting report, disgracefully named after the murderer, cataloged issues made clear in the pandemic, yet they were ignored as long-term care and older people were not a priority. Once again, when this pandemic is over, no one in Canada can say they didn't know about the situation in long-term care. Next slide. Along with being the most group likely to die of COVID-19 in Canada, older people are experiencing a greater risk of elder abuse. While there is no hard data on the documented examples of elder abuse at this point, although some of you in the field may be gathering it, physical abuse, child abuse, and domestic abuse are known to increase during and after disasters, and it's reasonable to assume that elder abuse has also increased. One advocate estimated the increase to be tenfold for older people and expressed disappointment that the federal government had not put further funding into battling abuse through awareness and support programs. At the time of writing, there has been no dedicated additional funding for shelters or mitigation programs for elder abuse during the pandemic. We know that older people face significant challenges due to age-related vulnerabilities, often the result of pre-existing health issues. This impairs their ability to get help. With respect to financial abuse, the Canadian Anti-Fraud Centre states that between March 6th and May 1st, there was reports of an estimated loss of 1.2 million to scams. And given that isolated older people and those with decreased cognitive capacity are often targeted, they are likely to be included in these statistics. Next slide, please. On one level, I'm very sad for what we've seen in the pandemic, in particular, the lack of care and respect for each other, which can be demoralizing and so utterly un-Canadian. Take, for instance, the ill-informed politicization of mask wearing. Enter the anti-maskers. I have seen more stop wearing masks, articles, rallies, and social media attacks than I can honestly believe. And it's a very dangerous misinformation that could quite literally lead to more deaths, particularly among older Canadians. Essentially, the anti-maskers are taking 100 years of public health information and saying it's an abuse of their rights. Now, how on earth can the concept of a piece of cotton over your mouth or cloth and nose become a topic of debate during an unprecedented health pandemic? No real doctor will tell a patient not to wear a mask during COVID-19. And let's face it, we have many, many laws that restrict our rights, from seatbelt to criminalization of drunk driving, and the list goes on. Similarly, those who have ignored public health directives that restrict social gatherings and thus knowingly contribute to the spread of the virus are startling in their self-centered lack of compassion. Next slide, please. I will advocate that we have a really great opportunity here to respond to the pandemic in a most compassionate way, and a way that reflects Canada's long, strong history of empathy and compassion, and our commitment to human rights, and a way to uphold the human rights of older persons. Let us support a United Nations Convention on the Rights of Older Persons. It is generally agreed that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is the foundation of international human rights law. In addition, a series of human rights treaties adopted since 1945 have expanded the body of human rights laws, such as the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, all of which have strong Canadian support and leadership. Yet we do not have a convention on the rights of older persons, like there are for women, children, and persons with disabilities. And the pandemic has shown that we really need one. Next slide, please. So here's Kieran and I at the United Nations. I'd like to take a quick moment to tell you how a convention is an opportunity to make for a more compassionate, age-inclusive world. It's a method to achieve positive change by combating ageism, guiding policymaking, improving accountability of governments at all levels, educating and empowering, and seeing older persons as rights holders with binding protection under international law. It could protect us from discrimination and allow older people to have equal opportunities to live independent lives, and it allows us to defend our human rights when we get older. Next slide, please. In Canada, you can argue that older people are protected by a comprehensive legal framework. So why do we need a UN convention in Canada? Well, first of all, it gives an extra layer of protection, particularly if the convention has complaints mechanisms. The Canadian government would be required to explain and rectify failures to fulfill the convention obligations, a requirement that could stimulate new initiatives to help older Canadians. It also gives a voice to organizations like many of you on this call to go in front of the Human Rights Council and talk about the issues facing older people in your countries. Now, given the aging of our population in Canada, a convention on older persons will be an element of the federal government's human rights policies. And research shows that states that have ratified human rights treaties and in which international non-governmental organizations are active are more likely to comply with the treaties. Surprisingly, Canada and other developed countries have not supported the Convention on the Rights of Older Persons. Similarly, Canada did not sign the Inter-American Convention protecting the human rights of older persons in June 2015, which was led by the South American countries. It's worth noting that the African Union has developed the African Charter on Human Rights for Older Persons, thus showing that the developing countries have really left the developed countries in the dust. It's, I think, a little more surprising given Canada's long history of defending human rights at the UN, from John Peter Humphreys, who drafted the original Universal Declaration of Human Rights, to our strong leadership at the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child and the Convention on Persons with Disabilities, to the criminal courts and the Lyme Mans treaties, and on and on. So it's really surprising that we have not stepped up and supported older people. And I'm hoping the pandemic has shone a light on that. So next slide. So I want to take a moment to tell you the arguments against the convention. So if you want to come on side with us, you'll have them at the ready and can quickly dispel them. Those arguing against a convention often note that older persons' rights have been enshrined in UN instruments. And if that were the case, why are there conventions that protect people with disabilities, women, and children? Others say that soft law protections, such as the Madrid Plan of Action on Aging, with suggested rights, already protect older persons' rights. But my experience in government negates that argument, as does academic research. Specifically, the last UN independent expert on aging, Rosa Kornfeld-Matt, in her report noted that the Madrid Plan of Action is not designed to comprehensively address existing protection gaps and is therefore not sufficient. Now, some argue that a convention is too costly. So, given that strain of thought, the rights of older persons are not worth the investment that protects other people. Others say drawing attention to older persons increases their social isolation. This is not borne out in evidence on a convention effectiveness. Next slide. Thank you. So what have we done? Well, one positive aspect of the systemic human rights violations in Canada, a country, by the way, with strong human rights legislation, is that it has really invigorated activism and revealed the need for a human rights convention on the rights of older persons. As I mentioned at the beginning, my organization has been working for a convention on the rights of older persons, both in Canada and internationally. Our work began in 2014 at the United Nations, when I spoke on behalf of the stakeholder group on aging on the absence of older people in the UN's largest anti-poverty program called the Sustainable Development Goals. I was shocked that we had to defend the rights of older persons, even at the world's human rights institutions. Now, there has been much positive news on our work to secure a convention, even though we're not there yet. In 2018, International Longevity Centre Canada brought forward a petition to the UN to have Canada lead and support the convention. And many of you on this call supported our work. We were very encouraged when the Canadian delegate to the United Nations announced that the door was open to Canadian support. Unfortunately, that was just an open door. They had not yet stopped through. We've also been extremely active in the media, particularly during the pandemic, and using every opportunity to bring up the issue of the convention, and others like Laura Tamblyn-Watts have done the same. On May 1st, Kieran and I presented to the House of Commons Parliamentary Committee on COVID-19, where we called for a convention on the rights of older persons. We also submitted a paper to the United Nations Human Rights Council, responding to their questionnaire on protecting human rights during COVID, and you can find it on our website. Also in May, the Secretary General of the UN wrote an important policy brief on the impact of COVID-19 on older persons at the United Nations. I'm proud to say our government was instrumental in getting 147 countries to sign on and support that document, which calls for stronger legal frameworks at international levels to protect the rights of older people. Next slide, please. So are we there yet? More recently, we have met with the Minister for Seniors Office and the Office of the Minister for Health. That happened yesterday, asking for both the convention and for activism on and changes to long-term care. We're meeting tomorrow with the Office of the Minister of Infrastructure to ask them about providing funding for infrastructure for long-term care. We have begun another writing campaign, which I hope you will join, asking for a convention on the rights of older persons. We've met with MPs and the government of Nova Scotia. We also supported the Speech from the Throne announcements on long-term care standards, criminal code changes to address neglect in long-term care, and actions to keep people home longer, and measures for personal support. On Monday, we saw the first announcement of federal funding for long-term care, and we hope there will be more, and we hope that they will make the connection to the Convention on the Rights of Older Persons as we discuss the lack of rights of older persons in long-term care. Most excitingly and recently, there was support from the Manitoba Senator, Patricia Bovey, who called for a convention on the rights of older persons on the floor of our Senate on November 19th. We want to thank her publicly for her amazing support. Now, interestingly, the Canadian UN Ambassador, Bob Ray, tweeted my tweet about Senator Bovey's announcement. So I'm kind of hoping that might be some kind of a sign, but we'll see. Now that leads me to the next quick point. Next slide, please. Throughout the pandemic, ILC Canada has used Twitter to get our key messages out. All major Canadian political figures have Twitter accounts, and we regularly tag them and GARAP's Twitter feed to make sure there is a wide awareness of our positioning. We've been pretty much relentlessly tweeting on each daily atrocity came out during the pandemic, and we are always linking that situation to human rights and to the need for a convention on the rights of older persons. We use clear messages with each tweet. Ill treatment of older persons is a human rights violation, and we need a UN convention to fight abuses. Next slide. So moving forward, let's fight for what's right. We need to learn and grow from the treatment of older people in this pandemic. We hope that Canada will continue its long, proud history of empathy and support for human rights at home and at the United Nations. I hope you will join us in demanding a convention and in supporting the call for our country, in our country, for real compassion and a change to our long-term care system and a change to the rights of older persons. Please write your ministers and your MP. Next slide. Think again of the older people impacted by COVID-19 in Canada. Each of them had a right to life, the right to be free of violence and abuse, and the right to family. To borrow loosely from Hillary Clinton, older people's rights are human rights. One thing the pandemic has taught us is that we need societal change, and it depends on all of us, government, civil society, and regular citizens. We need to come together to celebrate and respect the gift of longevity. ILC Canada's slogan is that human rights do not have a best before date. They are inherent, lifelong, grounded in compassion and empathy, and in solidarity. Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret. That was a great overview and really moving statement of many statements I think you've said around the need for a convention for the human rights of older persons. And as you indicated, I think COVID has really brought this to the forefront. We knew that this was happening before and the work that we've been doing, but as you said, now is the time to really move this forward. I'm going to ask our other panel members to now come online, we were going to ask each of them to give a short presentation on their position around the need for a convention. I'm going to start with Margaret Young from Age Noble, and she will start the presentation. That will then be followed by Marie and Karen, and then we'll open it up for discussion. So Margaret.
Great, thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Through this pandemic, different humanitarian and societal issues came to head, be it economic security, racial justice, personal freedom. And of course, amongst them is the rights for older persons. So as I listened to the different perspectives and I reflected, I came to realize that, all of us individually, collectively, want the rights of older persons to be recognized and codified through a convention. And I came to this because I see a triple equality multiplier effect when we have a convention for the older person. So what I mean is that first, a convention will address the inequalities and discrimination that's directed toward older persons today. Second, a convention will protect older persons from any cumulative negative impact based on intersectional forces that's happened over a lifetime. And third, a convention really empowers each and every one of us for a better aging narrative for tomorrow, because all of us are going to live longer and longer. So I'll quickly share what that means with an example through the pandemic, and it's to do with right to work. So discriminatory practices in the areas of recruiting, promoting, and retiring older workers has been documented in the Ontario Human Rights Commission in 2008. Yet 12 years later, we still see ageist attitudes in the workplace. Hiring practices in terms of you're overqualified, or that we want digital ready employees is still there. And of course, lately this year, we see IBM and its potential lawsuit from 140,000 employees who's claiming age discrimination for the layoff. So a rights instrument that's focused against ageism and discrimination will build stronger legislation and policy against age-based discriminatory practices at the workplace. The second multiplier, when we think of intersectionality, is really a great thing, be it our gender, our race, our socioeconomic circumstances. It makes us individual. And yet, as we proceed through our life course, it can present complexities. So through the COVID, if we look at the situation of gender and work, we'll see that there is that impact. RBC completed a paper in July that looked at the impact of the pandemic on the women's labor force. And what they found is that for the first time in 3 decades, unemployment rates for women is actually now higher than men. And furthermore, they found that between the months of February and May, 50% of the newly unemployed women will not be looking for work again in the very near future. We wonder why, and there are 2 reasons. One is that women are employed in 3 of the top 5 sectors that's most impacted in COVID, and that's most likely going to have the slowest recovery. And it'll be sectors like accommodation, food services, retail, social assistant, or healthcare assistants. And then secondly, women are generally the caregiver in the family. So with what happened in COVID, in the pandemic, as we saw, there's question about, daycare, toddlers, school, what's happening. And with all those uncertainties, women chose to stay at home. And with that, what we see is that depending on what happens with this cohort of women moving forward in terms of their work, their career, the financial security could potentially be impacted. And these type of issues is why today we see more older women suffering poverty versus men. And that's why we need a rights instrument that recognizes lifelong reskilling and an equity approach toward work opportunities. So the third equality multiplier is to do with the whole notion of aging and having the positive aging opportunity to have a longer lifespan. So global life expectancy right now, it's around 71 years old. A group of researchers from University of California and the Max Planck Institute of Demography actually did some research of 6 developed countries to kind of estimate where lifespan will go. And what they found is that for all these 6 developed countries, for babies who were born in the year 2007, they will actually grow beyond 100 years old. And it's half of the population of babies that grow, okay? And within those 6 developed countries that was researched, one of them is Canada. And in Canada, 50% of the babies that was born in 2007 is estimated to grow to 104 years old. So imagine, much longer lifespan. What happens to financial security and work? Scotiabank did a survey late last year with 1,000 panelists from across Canada, cross-section of millennials, Gen X, and boomers, and asked the question, what do you think about retirement and your future security? 70% of Canadians said that they're concerned they don't have enough money to retire. And 46% of the people who are said they will I'll probably end up retiring closer to 60 and 70. And 6% said, I will never retire. So when we look at this in terms of the importance of right to work today for older people, it's actually helping us to understand the complexity that's there and to figure things out for all of us in the future. So that's why when we look at a convention, it's really important to think of it from those 3 perspectives. Older persons today, life course impact over time that can happen to you and me, and as well, we're all living much longer. So the question is, what do we do about all this, right? So Margaret Gillis gave a very great, wonderful overview, thank you, about the things that we can do. And just to share with GARUP, which is a group that's global, as Margaret mentioned, 350 members across the globe are working on this. So we need more of us coming together to work on this. During the time of pandemic, the steering group at GARUP actually made a statement about the pandemic and how we should respond to the older person during the pandemic. And there were 4 key things. And I think it resonates throughout time, be it during COVID or after COVID. First is that ageism cannot and should not be tolerated. Second is that rights of older people should be protected and that they're on equal basis with everyone else, without discrimination, without exception. Third, the voices and the views of older persons should be taken into consideration anytime when we're planning and implementing actions or responses that's relevant to them. And most importantly, through COVID, we saw that a convention is needed because with convention, the rights are defined, and rights are defined and clarified, we can start enhancing, updating the legislation and policy needed to really protect and guarantee the rights of older persons. So with that, I'll wrap up my commentary. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Marie. Would you like to go next?
Certainly. Alors, bonjour tout le monde. It will be my only sentence in French, don't worry. It's a great pleasure to be with you today to talk about this so important issue. And I really want to thank Margaret Gillis for a great overview and a call for action. Margaret said that she invites us to use their letter. And I just want to say that this letter has been translated in French this week. So if some people want to use it in French, I will be more than happy to provide the document. So I'm a university professor at University of Sherbrooke, that's in Quebec, Canada. Everybody can hear my French accent. So Margaret said that she's been quite active, like many other Canadians, in the media during the past year. And I've been also in the French part of it because media coverage was so important. We have to raise our voices. We're talking of a problem that is really at the intersection of ageism, sexism, racism, and also ableism, because for many people, especially the ones in long-term care, they are there because they need important care services. Today, my point of view will be more with my other hat. I'm a member of the International Network for Prevention of Elder Abuse. I'm part of the board. And this network has been created in 1997. And we are an active member of the open-ended working group on aging in the purpose of strengthening the protection of human rights of older persons at the UN. Since April, the members of the International Network for Prevention of Elder Abuse have been holding weekly or bi-weekly meetings, and we've been addressing mistreatment of older persons in the pandemic context. And I had the pleasure to write a paper that has been recently published in the Journal of Adult Protection. And this is the basic of my talk today. This paper is available freely on the Canadian Network for Prevention of Elder Abuse website. It's also on my research chair website. So what have we been doing? Well, not only did we talk every week or 2 weeks, but also we conducted a survey where we gathered information on residential care facilities. And we had respondents from 16 countries. And those countries were coming from each continent of the world. So we kind of have an overview. We also had an important webinar on July 16 with 56 people from all around the world. So regarding the rights of older persons in that context, well, our members were saying that there's been a series of violations, such as, for sure, ageism, the loss of dignity, civil rights that were denied, barring of family visitors, poor management, no boundaries between cold and hot zones, a lack of staffing and equipment, a suspension of medical treatment, and also a lack of information given to family members. Especially, I would like to come back on the question of 3 points, actually: ageism, systemic and managerial problems, but also the effects of the implemented measures. We need to ask a series of questions. And the first one was the view of the older person solicited during this period? And actually, they were quite invisible. We made decisions for them, but certainly not with them. Regarding the management, like Margaret Gillis said, the reports from the Canadian Army were quite difficult to read. And we know that the basic needs were not met: food, hydration, hygiene. There's been also a shortage of staff. That's why the Army came in. And regarding the way that the measures were implemented, well, actually, the family members and the personal caregivers were not at all part of the solution. And we have to acknowledge that employees in those facilities are often working in precarious conditions. All that to say that these discussions from the International Network of Prevention of Elder Abuse has reinforced the idea that an international charter of the rights of older persons needs to be swiftly adopted. It is anticipated that this convention would address the importance of advanced directives in health and social services, the rights of older persons in residential care facilities and their families, and also the respect for the decisional capabilities of older persons. Let's work together in that way.
Thank you, Marie. And Karen, would you like to comment?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rianne. And thank you to all of you. I think there's over 500 people, I believe, or registered anyway, for attending today. Margaret, Marie, Thank you for your wonderful presentations. You know, I find it really hard to do this virtually. I love to look at people in their eyes and talk in an audience. So I'm just going to pretend that all 300 or 500 of you are in the room with me today. And I would often talk about various things. And I'm going to just start off as though I'm talking to you in a room. I'd like each of you to look to your left and look to your right. And I hope you have someone sitting next to you. You can pretend, because I have good news and bad news. The good news is that 1 out of the 3 of you will have dementia by the time you'll be 80 years of age. That's the bad news, sorry. The good news is it won't be you, it's whoever is sitting next to you. So you don't have to worry about it, right? If you believe what I just said, then please welcome to the world of denial, because we have denial. It's part of human mentality, and that's how our brain works, is we deny things. And I want to start off with that because, you know, we've talked about the pandemic. If I were to ask you, what are the signs and symptoms of COVID-19? You can probably rhyme them off very quickly. But if I were to ask you, what are the signs and symptoms of the pandemic of ageism? I want you to pause and reflect, because we all have a little bit of it in us. And we need to keep it in check, because if we don't, we end up getting what we have today: a disproportionate impact on older persons because of COVID-19. You need to be able to recognize the ageism in yourself, in the way you think, in the way you feel, and the way you behave every moment of the day. And when you look at yourself in the mirror, to talking to people in the street, listening to a joke about older persons, to making big decisions about who gets long-term care or health care. That ageism has permeated throughout our society, and we must do something about it. There's so much data on the amount of death and suffering, and death is measurable. It's measured because we measure people who die. We know how many people are dead. We also know how many people are infected with COVID because we measure it, but we don't measure suffering. There is no way to capture that easily, and I challenge each of you to think about that. I see it in my work life. I see patients every single day in the hospital, in the community, and in long-term care homes. And it is not a pretty place. And you know, you've all talked about it, so I won't belabor the point. I think we all need to remember what it is that human beings want out of life. We want to feel safe. We want to have a purpose of doing something useful with our lives. And we need someone to love or someone to love us. And those 3 things actually make up the quality of life that we all want, including older persons. We have to make sure that this pandemic of ageism is actually taken care of. Now, I'm a visual person. I want to give you another visual. I always say to people, look for smoke. And where there is smoke, there's going to be fire. We have had smoke for decades in our system of healthcare. And now we're dealing with a major forest fire, which is what ageism has done. Now we have to send in the big bombers with you know, to put out forest fires. We should have done something about this ages ago, and we're still not doing it. So I want to finish off with 2 points in building on Margaret Gillis's talk and Margaret Young's talk and Marie's talk. I want to challenge each and every person in this room to make a commitment to themselves that they will check every thought, every feeling, and every behavior from now on to make sure that it's not ageistic. And I'll give you an example. When I get woken up at 3 o'clock in the morning to see a patient, you know, when it's an older person who's got multiple problems, big, long medication lists, big, long social lists of social problems, I don't like it either. But then I remind myself, this is what my job is. I've signed up for this. And I check my ageism. I need you to check that within yourself. Second thing I would love for you to do is to go on our website and write to the ministers. The letter is there. You just have to sign it and send it off. It's very simple. It's not complicated. And also write to your MP. There's work being done at the UN from the top down, but we need a grassroots movement from the bottom up. And I would challenge all hundreds of people in this room to go out there and talk about this with anyone they can in their sphere of influence to make this happen. Thank you very much. And thank you all for attending. Sincerely grateful for your presence today.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you to all the panelists for your great comments. We've had a lot of individuals in the chat box just commenting on some of the important points that each one of you have been made. I'm going to turn it over to Benedict, who is now going to start our questions. We have many questions that are in the question and answer box. We will try our best to get to all of them. We can't guarantee we will be able to get through them all. However, Benedict and I will kind of sort through and try our best to do that. So I'm going to turn it over to Benedict.
Hi, everybody. So before I start reading out some of the questions that were asked, all of them excellent, by the way, we've had quite a few people asking about the letter that Margaret was referencing and that Karen was referencing. I have shared the link both in the Q&A and in the chat box. We'll also be sharing that link again at the end on our final slides, and you'll be able to click on that and go. You can find the letter on the website of the ILC. I will reshare it before this webinar is over. So I'll start with actually the very first question that came in from Leslie, who was asking, or rather commenting first on the absence or the lack of statistical information on older women, and asking if any of you have any information about whether the majority of elder residents in long-term care and nursing homes are women. Is there a link between this and the ageism and the neglect that they've been encountering? It's an open-ended question, but I thought I would bring it to the group. Marie, I saw you nodding.
Well, due to demographic, the population, older adults actually, there's much more women in long-term care institution than men, that's for sure. So that's why I was saying earlier that we have to link, it's a question of intersectionality. We have to link ageism, sexism, racism, and ableism. That's certainly there. So is it worse because it's more women? We can think that maybe it is, yes.
Thank you. We have a question from Kathleen, who is saying, much is being said about the people who work in long-term care during COVID, who are predominantly from racialized and marginalized population groups and underpaid for the work that they're expected to do. How does the treatment of those staff reflect ageism, and what can we do to better support staff who work in aging care, and also to not only treat them well while they're working, but also attract and retain them? Does anyone have a take on this one? It's a big question.
I can start. I'm happy to start. I mean, it's well documented that they have been treated terribly. They have put their lives and their lives of their family on the line, as I mentioned when I was speaking. And I think it's important for all of us to recognize that is very hard work. Those people are very dedicated. They've been put in terrible positions because many of them aren't given full-time work, so they have to move from place to place, which was part of the reason the pandemic moved around quickly in long-term care. And they weren't given proper PPE. And the way, unfortunately, the reaction to the pandemic in the initial phases is we worked really quickly to protect the hospitals, and that was all very good and important. Of course, we want to protect our frontline workers in hospitals, but we needed to do the same in long-term care. And that was a real gap in Canada, and I think it was probably a gap in other places in the world, given the death rates in long-term care all over certainly the developed world. So I think we have to stand up for those rights. We absolutely need more long-term care workers. One of the things in this discussion Kieran and I had yesterday with the Canadian government was that we need to bring in more immigrants that have those kinds of skills, but we need to treat them properly. I mean, this is just basic decency. And by the way, just a quick comment on that. Those people, that is the home long-term cares are the home of those older people. And I think we really are missing the concept of home, and treating the workers bad makes that home less comfortable and less, of a home for people who are there. So we really need to address that issue. That's a really key point in all of these discussions. Thanks.
And just to build on that just for a minute. So the last question was about females versus males. There's way more females than males in that age group. And I think Marie said that, but especially in institutions, in Canada, we institutionalize more people than most developed countries in the world in Canada. So, and we've had, as I think Margaret pointed out, the dubious distinction of having the worst mortality in long-term care of any civilized nation in the world. So there's a connection here between it not being a good place to live and it not being a good place to work. And Margaret Gillis just said that unless we address those two key indicators, is it a good place for me to go and live? It's my home. And then is it a good place for me to go and work? Is it safe? Will I be happy there? And will I be healthy working there? You can take the healthiest and most skilled person in the world, you put them in a toxic environment, they get sick. And that's what's happened to long-term care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And actually, I've got a, sorry.
Go ahead, Benedict. No, go ahead, Benedict.
I was going to say, I have a kind of a follow-up question to that. We've had quite a few questions about the rules of for-profit homes and how two questions wrapped in one. How do we change the rules of for-profit long-term care homes? And also, how do we improve the ratio of patient to caregiver? Because that can be done in the future, but the need is right now. And how do we palliate to that? It's a tricky one. We're not asking you to solve
You're on
everything.
mute, Margaret.
Okay. Well, I think there was a little bit of money in the budget to the economic indicator yesterday from or it was Monday, I guess, from the federal government, some funding in to get workers into long-term care more quickly with an immediate program. But I think we need to think about, changing the rules really hugely in respect to long-term care. And I just want to pick up, I think there was a message that went across the screen from someone. We need to also recognize with workers in long-term care, there's a whole issue about racialized and women. So there's sort of a triple whammy here in terms of dealing with ageism and work in an area where you're working with ageism, but also racialized people and women. So again, we really need to stick up for those rights.
And Benedict, if you think about this in the short, medium, and long term, I think on the long term, with proper training and investment and having some national standards, I think things will get better. And we do need long-term care homes for a certain small segment of the population. But most people don't live in long-term care. They live in their homes, in the community, and we don't even have proper supports for them. So I think on the short term, we're in for a real ride because we can't train a lot of people all very quickly. These skill sets, the attitudes, the knowledge and skills require time and effort. And we don't even have the personnel to do the work at this point. So it will be a little bit of a rough ride in the next few months, I would say.
And on independent owned long-term care homes, if we had proper national standards that had teeth, like they do in other countries, and I know Australia is one of the examples where they have it, where, if you don't apply to treat people properly, you're closed down. If we had those, that would make a huge difference. Now, you can get into whether we should have them or not, or whether long-term care should be part of the healthcare system. That's a whole other discussion. But at a minimum, with our system right now, we need to have really strict rules on what can and can't go on. Hand it to Marie.
Marie?
Yeah, I just want to add an important information though. When you look at the reports on what happened in long-term care, you do realize that there were some good things in private and some bad things in private, but also some good things in public and some terrible things in public too. So we have to be very careful not to think that because it's private, it's necessarily bad, and because it's public, it's necessarily good. That would be a total mistake.
That's a very good point. I totally agree with that. So.
Over to you, Rayan.
Sure. I guess just two questions. The first one is just around the intergenerational. We're talking about ageism and getting people into the workforce, into long-term care. But there was a question around intergenerational solidarity. Becomes a challenge when, on one hand, there's elder abuse, and on the other hand, there's a focus around youth. And we just wondered what your comment is. How do we make that shift, I guess, in terms of moving towards this convention? But how do we? It has always been a challenge that seniors aren't the priority, it seems.
Sylvia Perel-Levin, who is an international worker and a great person with respect to the work on convention, just reminded me while I was speaking, she sent me a text saying, referring to a meeting yesterday at the UN, where they talked about the fact that we need a huge culture change to our culture and norms. And what you're asking there in terms of the intergenerational solidarity, we need to start really addressing ageism and having a change in our cultural norms, because we denigrate aging all the time.
So on building on that, I think we need to think about ageism as COVID-19. Okay, it can infect anyone, and we need to figure out how to stop that, because it's an attitudinal, it's a socially learned behavior. And our children learn it, and then they become teenagers, and they learn more, and then they become adults. So it's a very complex situation, but that's the simple way to think about it. We need to start with ourselves.
Margaret Young?
Yeah, and that's why it's a very good point about the intergenerational piece, because it's interesting when let's say Black Lives Matters happened, it's overwhelming that everybody across all ages is there on the mantle, fighting against, fighting for Black Lives Matters and racial justice. But so that's why when I kind of looked at everything that's happened throughout, the pandemic, it's really realizing that for each one of us, we have long lives and that we're going to get older. And that's why I specifically look up, wow, babies born in 2007, 50% is going to live to 100. So if I talk to my niece, who's a teenager right now, hey, you're going to live to 100. What do you think it'll look like? What does it mean when you hang out with grandma? So things like that is things that we can also, we need to be on the mantle to say this is not right, but we also need to shift and say, hey, this is all and each one of us part of our life. And then I think that might be the way to really kind of get us closer to seeing the lens that, ageism is not right, discrimination is not right at any age.
Yeah.
Thanks. Any other comments? I'm just going to ask one more question, then I'm going to turn it back to Benedict. We have a question from Laura asking the Western European governments, with some narrow exceptions such as Canada, have not yet not been supportive of the Unicorp. Do you think that the differential impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on older persons in these countries might be a pivot point and allow change in policy?
I guess I would say I sure hope so. It's a little bit like Margaret Young just mentioned. We really need to get moving on our activism internally. And I think that's the same thing for the European countries. I was actually on a call with the FPT ministers for human rights about 2 weeks ago. And I was the only Asian group that was invited to it that I could tell. And I wasn't allowed to speak, but I could ask a question, which I did. But of the 8 speakers on human rights, one person mentioned the elderly. And the topic was COVID-19 and human rights. And no one mentioned the death rate of older people and the situation in long-term care. So we have a lot of work to do, even with the human rights organizations in our countries, and I think the organizations internationally. So, get on your work clothes, because there's a lot to be done.
Mm-hmm. And, only 42 countries have signed up so far. So we need many more before we can actually achieve the convention. But if COVID-19 doesn't do it, I'm not sure what will. I think this is the worst, most egregious abuse of human rights for older people. And if we don't push for the convention now, I'm not sure. But then, I don't want to be negative, but I think, Margaret Young was saying that cohort of people will live to be 100. I don't know what their lives will be like, forget ours.
And so as a follow-up to that, we have several people who asked, in your opinion, why is there such a reluctance towards that convention? Why has it taken so many years, so many efforts? Can you provide us with a sense of why it's not more of an obvious movement?
I'll just start with that. It starts with denial. It starts with denial. It starts with minimization. It starts with rationalization. Those are the three defenses that we all use to make things go away from our front. And yet, you know, when you see a joke related to an older person, people get frustrated with older people. That those are all very implicit biases we have. And as Margaret Gillis in her talk said, it's gone from that to being overt now. It's way out in the open. So it has become much more pervasive and egregious, but that is the issue. And we don't see it in ourselves. So that's why I challenged every single person to challenge themselves to look for ageism within themselves and then in their family and their friends, and to catch them and check them and have them change. The 3 C's of cognitive behavior therapy is you catch the bad thought, you check it to see if it's good or bad, and then change it if you need to change it. Those are the 3 C's of cognitive behavior therapy. And you can apply that principle to yourself.
Thank you. Marie?
Yeah, maybe I could add why it's been so long. Well, 2 things that we heard is, first of all, and Margaret Gillis said it earlier, is many countries think that the rights of older people are already protected in other piece of legislation or in other conventions, which is totally false because there's huge gaps. And the other thing is, when you have a convention and you sign the convention as a country, then it's a mandatory reporting thing. That means that it's a binding instrument and you have to report. And some countries don't want to have more reporting to do. They already feel that they're actually filling enough report to the UN. But I don't think that for us, it's a very good point of view to defend.
Well, reporting also reveals gaps, and it makes you have to work and make changes. And you know, I worked quite closely on the Convention on the Rights of the Child when I was in government. I had a career in government prior to this, and I was involved in the reporting mechanisms for the Canadian government on the rights of the child. And Canada got regularly taken to task, and quite rightly so, on a number of issues that actually led to work to change it. So, I mean, I've seen it in action, the convention, and it made me an absolute, you know, fanatical supporter as a result of seeing it in action, compared to the Madrid Plan of Action, which I was also responsible for reporting on. That took about a week, and it took us a year to get ready for the meeting at the UN on the child, on the rights of the child, because we were tracking what we were doing and looking for gaps and looking to fill them.
You know, if you don't measure something, nothing gets done. You know, we measure deaths because it's a hard outcome. It's an easy death. We measure COVID-19 rates and something gets done. But this kind of work, ageism, you know, suffering, anxiety, loneliness, doesn't get measured. And so you can't do anything about it. No one's going to put dollars and cents to it unless you capture it and measure it. So I'm very strong on measurement, and unless we find ways to assess it and measure it, nothing will be done.
Yeah.
And the convention does actually measure a few things.
Yeah. And I'll just add one more thing. I think the measurement piece is definitely very important. You know, like when we look at some of the other conventions that came into being, the stakeholder, the person who's holding the rights, actually was very outspoken, key part of the movement. So when we look at the rights for the persons with disability, their tagline is, nothing about us without us. They own the rights and they're going to tell you what's going on. So when we look at our cohort of older persons, especially people who are in the 80s and 90s and 70s, they come from a time when it's World War II. They come from a time when it's post-World War II. They endure a lot throughout their lifetime. So there might be the perspective that, well, I've endured all this, I can handle this. You know, this is my issue. I don't want to burden my family or whatnot. So they're not as ready to vocalize their voice. So one of the key things that we need to do as NGOs, as we kind of work with our different, stakeholders or do our research and whatnot at universities, is really to help that older person's voice surface. So you saw how powerful it was when Margaret Gillis put that slide up with just only 3-4 key emotional words of what the individuals are feeling when they were at a long-term care home. Can you imagine that we can get the voices of all the older persons talking, saying, this is why I want my rights? So I think that's a key missing part. That's if we can have that, it will help move the convention forward.
Margaret Young, and absolutely brilliantly put. And I just want to add one more thing. A lot of people that we work with, especially the work I do, they don't even have a voice. They can't even speak. And they don't have their cognitive ability to make their needs or their wants, their basic needs actually vocalized. We have to make sure that their voices are captured too. Just wanted to put that up there.
There was actually a question about that I was going to bring up later. Somebody asking, how were the voices of older people themselves included in this work towards a convention? I guess we've sort of touched on that. Margaret?
Well, lots of organizations that are representing older people are part of the movement. So, it's done through that way. I mean, most of those groups at the United Nations, for instance, are reflective or membership groups, either membership groups or other groups that represent older people. So, but you know what? I think in Canada, in terms of pushing for the convention and getting rights, I think we need to do a little more rallying of older people, demanding and showing why their rights are as important as anyone else's. So there's still work to be done on that, I think.
But Benedict, we do need ideas, because I think we're not there yet. Like I don't know if we have the answer to that question. So if anyone in the audience has anything to contribute, my email is kieranribeiro@hotmail.com. Just send me, or any one of us, we'd love to hear from people, because we want to capture those voices, and I don't really know exactly how to do it well.
Thank you. And yes, I'll say this again, the slides that you saw at the start of this presentation are going to be made available online. They'll be sent to the participants. They contain the contact information for all the people present today speaking, including Ryan and myself. So if you want to do a follow-up, or if you want to engage with Kieran about this last question, please do. Ryan, did you want to read another question? Do we still have time? We do, yes. Oh, you're muted.
Sorry. We have time for, I think, for a few more questions. And then there has been some inquiries about the actual activities for calls for actions, which we are going to get to after we do a few more comments from our panel members that gives some more specific details about how you can individually and as a community get involved. There was a question about just looking at other countries and any models that we could learn from, I don't know, I think Marie or maybe Margaret had already commented on this, that we can learn from and following, and I know there was a mention of Australia, but are there other countries that we could call upon to use their models in the work that we're doing in Canada?
There are a lot. There are a lot of great examples. Is the sound okay? For instance, besides Australia, which brought in the national standards and teeth behind the national standards, so that's one in terms of just long-term care on national standards pieces. And they, if you look, they had far less deaths, in their long-term care homes than we did. But Kieran raised a point earlier on, or it might have been Marie or Margaret, one of the other smart panelists mentioned, that we really need to look at the continuum of care. It's not just long-term care that's underfunded and badly, dealt with in some cases in the country, but we really need to upload that front end so that it allows people to stay in their homes longer. And that's a really key piece. And there's lots of great examples of that. And Denmark's the one everybody in the business kind of talks about, but the other Nordic countries have got great examples of really uploading their home support at the front end. And that's actually better, funding wise. It's better for the economy, and it also makes people happier. And so there's a lot to be said for that. And it's an area we've cut and cut and cut, like long-term care. So I think we need to be doing both of those things.
Rayan?
Sorry, Benedict. We're trying to navigate between the two of us. There has been a few people commenting on the criminal legislation regarding to elder abuse. And I know that in Canada, the Minister for Seniors in their mandate letter had talked about addressing changing the criminal legislation to include elder abuse. Is there any comment from the panel members around that and how that might influence or be included within the convention or moving forward in terms of having a criminal code for elder abuse, because we don't currently have one, whether that's pros or cons, or if that would make a difference in the work moving forward. Anyone want to comment on that?
Well, that's a very good question. I will do a brief comment. If we look at our criminal code, the only thing that is very specific in order to elder abuse is an article that reminds to judges that when they are looking at a case where the victim is an older person, they can, and they're not obligated, they can look at it as a factor that will be aggravating when it comes to the time of sentencing. That's the only thing we have in the criminal code for now. For the rest, you have to look at assault or other type of crimes that are not age specific, but really are describing incidents. We've been working for a while trying to see how we could actually improve the criminal code. And I'm quite happy to hear that now we will probably have at least something regarding neglect in caring facilities. That's a step. It's probably not enough, but at least we're going for a step. Because for now, what we have is mainly provincial legislation that are related to health and social services that will address the reporting of elder abuse in institutions, and in some provinces, the reporting of elder abuse in the community. So we don't have, beside the criminal code, we don't share any other legislation. So now we could say that regarding elder abuse in Canada, we have 10 provinces and 3 territories. So that means 13 different ways of acting.
Can I just add that if we did have a convention on the rights of older persons, that would actually give the legal system in most countries a framework to build legislation around elder abuse, I think. And I think it's been shown to be the case in with the Convention of Disabled Persons as well as the child. So there is legislation that's built around that. So I think it would give more teeth to the legal system if we had a convention.
Okay, it is here in BC 9:26, which means we have about 4 minutes left. So there's been so many more questions coming in. I don't know if you've monitored the chat and the Q&A. People are really engaged. Thank you very much, everyone, for your questions and your participation. I'll have one more question before we call it for today. Lorna is asking, how might current statistical longevity projections be affected by the mortality that's associated with the pandemic? And it might have implications for recommendations in the future. What's likely to be that impact? It's a big one. Once again, not easy questions.
I mean, I think we have to see the end results and what, so it's a bit hard to guess now. All I guess I can say is I hope that the death, unnecessary death of almost 8,000 older people in the country is going to drive somebody to do something. You know, honestly, all of us should be ashamed of that as Canadians. That is just, it was unnecessary and it's wrong. And so I guess I just want to leave that thought with people. We all need to be fighting for the rights of those people that died, the people that suffered, that, you know, we haven't been able to capture. And you know, I guess we need those statistics, but I think right now we've got enough evidence of a system that's really gone wrong, and an ageist system. So thank you for both of you, both your organizations, for giving us a voice today. I really think it's been important.
Yes,
really appreciate it.
Absolutely, thank you.
Thanks for coming. Rayan, do you want to share your screen so we can briefly, once again, share the relevant information with everybody. So we were speaking earlier about the call to action. I don't think we need to galvanize you any further. You all sound pretty ready. So as we mentioned, on the website of the International Longevity Center of Canada, that you will find a letter that you can download, you can copy, you can alter it if you want to personalize it, and you can send it out to your different levels of decision makers. One good time to do it is just coming up right now on December 10th is the International Human Rights Day. So if you are a social media user, for instance, that's a good time to be using that tool, to tweet about it, to post comments about it. You can use the hashtags Human Rights Day. You can make a specific statement calling, as Margaret Gillis was saying at the start, calling for a convention and tagging certain politicians or decision makers in your message. You can send the letter. Obviously, you don't have to do it on December 10th, but that would be a very nice symbolic effort, and you can keep it going for until the end of the year and beyond. On your screen right now, you should be able to see the links. So all this information will be available to all of you today who are present on the call. You have Margaret's and Kieran's email addresses, the email addresses of Mr. Seniors, Mr. Foreign Affairs, and the link to download the letter. We really hope that you will consider supporting this effort and keep it in mind. And as Kieran said, always check your ageism and everywhere you see it, including in yourself, and start changing the way we think about a lot of things and the way we talk about a lot of things. If you're looking to follow up with any of us, you can find our information here. You can also find it. Oh, sorry. Thank you, Ryan. I was missing one step. Margaret Young was here speaking, and actually Kieran to a certain extent too, also representing the Global Alliance for the Rights of Older People, otherwise known as GARIP. They also have some tips and recommendations for everyone. If you're looking to get involved, looking for ways to do something, to participate, you can see on your screen a list of ideas. You can also find the information on their website. I shared it earlier, but I will share it again before everybody leaves. Margaret Young, it might come to you faster than, oh, there it is, www.rightsofolderpeople.org. That's where you can find GARIP. And if you're looking to speak with CNPA or EAPO, you can find our information on the next slide as well. And thank you for the reminder, not to finish on a too materialistic a note, but yesterday was Giving Tuesday. Both of our organizations are not-for-profits, charities. We try to do so much work with so little, and every little bit counts. So if you didn't have a chance yesterday and you appreciated our webinar today and you want to see more like this one, please consider supporting us. The links are included to our donate pages that will help us continue our work and continue to offer these kinds of webinars for free to the greatest number of people. Now that we've talked about the boring details, you can find our contact information here. Do not hesitate to follow up with us. We are going to be saving the chat box and the Q&As, and we'll try to pull something together. It might not be immediate, but we will be working on it because there was a lot to address. And once again, if you want to let us know how we did, we're going to do a little evaluation. Rayanne, I'll let you take care of that part.
Yeah, so just at the conclusion of the webinar, you will get just a quick pop-up screen just asking you to complete the survey. It's on SurveyMonkey. It'll probably take you maybe a couple minutes just to click the boxes of your feedback. We would appreciate your information and ideas. Just based on today, I think we might reach out to our partners and do a part 2 based on the uptake and the interest in so many questions that we had today, and seeing how we can continually keep this on the agenda and moving it forward as we go into the new year. So I want to thank everyone today, as well as our panel members for sure. I know you're all extremely busy, and this is a priority, I know, for each one of you. in terms of moving this agenda forward and having a convention on the rights of older persons. And I encourage everyone that's involved today, speak to your colleagues, your family, start the conversation and moving this agenda forward. We all have a role to play in the prevention of abuse and to protect the rights of older adults. And again, I don't know if anyone of the panel members have any final remarks they'd like to say as we close, but again, thank you everyone for participating. And thank you for our translators who have joined us today. And we would continue to offer ASL. We think it's very important for everyone to have accessibility to this important information. So thank you all again. We will be posting the recording on our website within the next few days. And as Benedict said, we'll try to follow up on the questions that we weren't able to respond to, or do a further session and just addressing some of those concerns. So thank you all and have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.